I would like tonight to focus on Europe's so-called refugee crisis. And I think I owe it to you to explain why I'd like to adapt that focus. And let me do that in three ways. Firstly, it seems to me to be almost perverse to be addressing a conference on migration and not speak about what's going on in Europe. I left the continent yesterday, and this is a continent that is fraying at the edges, that is threatening to rip itself apart over an issue that I still don't think needs to be thought of as a crisis. It's quite bizarre to me what is happening in Europe over a relatively small number of people. Whether we like it or not, for good or for bad, the main migration story in the world today is what is happening in Europe. And I think what's happening in Europe actually transcends migration and refugees. It's a bigger geopolitical global issue that I think is of concern. And I think it should be concerning not just for Europeans, but for all of us. You should be concerned if you care about international protection and what's happening to the refugee regime. You should be concerned if you care about the future of the European Union. And you should be concerned because proximity does not equate to responsibility. I think Canadians and everyone else in the world has a responsibility, as well as do Europeans, where most of the refugees, certainly from Syria, are arriving at the moment. The second reason I'd like to adopt this focus of Europe is that I think it is directly relevant to what we've been discussing today. We've been discussing cities. Make no mistake, the focus of the challenge, the burden, the crisis, if you want to use that word, is absolutely on cities in Europe today. Cities like Malmö in southern Sweden, where towards the end of last year, something like 10,000 people a week were arriving each week. Think of the challenges that means for housing, for education, for health, at least in the short term. We've been discussing talent, and we heard from Helena the importance of talent. Now, it's a myth that all of the Syrians arriving in Europe today are talented. Of course they're not, but they're certainly self-selecting. They certainly have wherewithal. They certainly have potential. They certainly represent a future talent pool if we can manage their integration, I think, effectively. And thirdly, I think, of course, we've been speaking about the importance of diversity. I see the influx of migrants and refugees today in Europe as a way of revitalizing Europe and adding the diversity that Europe needs to survive. It's an aging, greying, conservative economy and society, and I think migration can help to transform that. The final reason I'd like to focus on Europe is that I think what is happening in Europe is symptomatic of some wider challenges that we as a community of policymakers and thinkers and politicians dealing with migration and refugees really need to come to terms with. And there are three specific challenges, and I'd like to focus and structure my presentation around those three challenges. The first is the growing gap between perceptions and reality when it comes to migration and refugees. And I'll illustrate that through some examples around Europe's refugee challenge at the moment. The second challenge I see is how to resolve the increasing conflict between the short-term goals of our policymakers and politicians, and those are understandable. We live in democracies. We have to win elections in the next 3 or 4 years, and the fact that migration has long-term dividends. Short-term interests, no staying power to realize the long-term dividends. I see that as a second real challenge across the world in terms of migration and refugees today. The third, and for me the most important challenge we face, is the shrinking space for objective debate. That this debate has become increasingly polarized. And I find that very concerning in all of the countries that I have the honor and the pleasure to visit and speak on these sorts of issues. So let me structure my presentation around those three challenges and illustrate them with some examples from what I think is taking place in Europe at the moment. Firstly, the growing gap between perception and reality. This is something that really confounds us in Europe. The evidence is clear and irrefutable. Migrants on the whole do not compete for our jobs. Migrants on the whole put more into the welfare state than they take out of the welfare state. Migrants on the whole are no more likely to be criminals or terrorists or a health threat than are the nationals in the countries where they are settling. And yet, in Europe, we have the rise of anti-immigration sentiment, of xenophobia, of Islamophobia. How can we convey to and educate and make people understand the reality is that migration is on the whole good, and yet you think that on the whole migration is bad? This gap between perception and reality is really quite confounding, and many of us are struggling to work out how to bridge it. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll give you a few ideas about how we might try to bridge it. Let me illustrate that gap between perception and reality with a few observations on Europe's so-called refugee crisis. And I'll stop saying so-called, but every time I say crisis, imagine inverted commas around the word. Firstly, let's not underestimate the challenge, and I certainly don't want to stand here and underestimate the challenge that Europe faces. Look at the numbers. Last year, 2015, over 1 million migrants and refugees arrived in Europe. That was 4 times the number that arrived in 2014. 2015 was a record year in terms of arrivals. 1 million people is a lot of people. This year, in the first 60 days of this year, something like 120,000 more people have arrived in Europe. That is 10 times the number who arrived over the same period of time last year. So if you were worried about 2015, frankly, you ain't seen nothing yet. 2016 and maybe 2017 are going to be the big years and the big numbers. 2015 was relatively modest, we think, compared to what's coming. So of course, the numbers matter. So do the deaths. IOM is reporting that something like 3,650 people drowned, mainly drowned, a few died in the back of trucks, sadly, mainly drowned, trying to cross the Mediterranean, trying to get to Europe. I don't think many of you are Europeans, but as a European, I just want to take a step back and reflect on what I've just said. The cradle of democracy, the home of the 1951 Convention on Refugees, a continent that has prided itself on rebuilding after wars, on stamping out persecution, on trying to be welcoming to other people. 3,600 people drowned in the Mediterranean trying to get there. We should be ashamed, frankly, and I think I'm ashamed as a European to reflect on that. And of course, there are other factors that make this a really significant challenge. Increasing numbers of unaccompanied minors, sometimes very young children arriving in large numbers in Europe at the moment. Mixed migration. This isn't just about Syrian refugees, it's about Albanians and Eritreans and Afghans and Iranians, some of whom are certainly refugees, many of whom are probably not refugees. And of course, managing mixed migration is a challenge. So in all sorts of ways, Europe is certainly facing a challenge, but I don't think it's a crisis. I think you can fairly easily put this challenge into a context which makes you realize that it need not be seen as a crisis. Firstly, don't forget the numbers. 85% of the world's refugees are in poorer countries. The crisis is in Pakistan and Turkey and Kenya and Tanzania. It's certainly not in Germany or France or Belgium or the other countries that are reacting rather passionately, let's put it that way, to this so-called crisis. Let's not forget that even the focus of Syrian refugees is not Europe. There are 6 million Syrians displaced inside their own country. There are 3 or 4 million Syrians now in Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon, and a fewer number coming to Europe. So even if you focus on Syrians alone, Europe is not facing the burden. If you want to widen this out to migration, 20 million refugees worldwide, 240 million migrants worldwide. In all sorts of ways, the numbers don't add up. This is not a crisis in any way if you think about the numbers and try to adopt some sort of global perspective. You can also adopt a perspective when you think about what we are talking about. The world's richest single market, 500 million people. And we are fraying at the edges, and the EU project is under threat because of the arrival of a couple of million people. It just, to me, doesn't add up at all. As I wrote today with Ratner in the Globe and Mail, I don't think the crisis is about numbers at all. I think the crisis is about confidence. Europeans no longer trust their governments to manage migration. Political leaders in Europe, I think with the exception of Mrs. Merkel, no longer have the confidence to stand up and say what is clearly right and what they clearly know to be right. And the entire EU project, I think, is lacking confidence and, as I say, falling apart at the seams. So the refugee crisis illustrates this gap between perceptions and realities, and how to bridge that gap or close that gap is something that's very much on my mind at the moment. The second theme, if you like, for this evening, the challenge of resolving short-term policy objectives. We have to win elections. We have to make sure our voters are happy with the fact, and it's truth, that migration on the whole pays dividends in the long term. I think that's a reality, and I think we should not ignore the reality. I think it's true that in the short term, migration, especially of the scale that we're seeing in Europe today, will pose challenges. I gave you the example of Malmo. Let me give you another example. A good friend of mine who teaches in an inner-city school in London. He's left-wing, he's pro-migration, I think he's a pretty good teacher, and he always tells me this: 10 years ago, teaching was a challenge. I had 70% of the kids were from England, maybe 30% were from Bangladesh, and it was a challenge because the 30% spoke a different language at home, they had different cultural reference points, they wanted different holidays, and making this class work was interesting and challenging, but I made it work. Today, in an inner city class in London, you have 30% English kids, some Bangladeshis, some Albanians, a couple of Kosovans. And by the way, they move all the time because they're being redistributed. There's an Iraqi, and we're not quite sure where he's from, might be Ethiopia, might be Eritrea. Wonderful. We as intellectuals, we as this sort of bubble of intelligentsia celebrate multiculturalism. I think being on the coalface, being on the front line is challenging and difficult. Whether you're a school teacher or delivering healthcare or trying to provide housing, of course it's a challenge. In the short term, migration is challenging. In the long term, it pays enormous dividends. It fills demographic gaps. It fills labour market gaps. It brings innovation. It brings diversity. It brings entrepreneurship. It brings all of the things that make Toronto and Canada and London and New York great cities and great countries. That's what migration does, but you have to have the staying power. And of course, our politicians and policymakers don't have the staying power. So bridging that second gap between short-term goals and long-term dividends is something else I think we need to reflect on. The third, and for me, the most concerning of the issues that I see coming out of Europe at the moment is the shrinking space for an objective, evidence-based, sensible debate. What I see in Europe today is an increasing polarization. You either find yourself at this end of the spectrum, and you think that all Syrians are heroes and all Syrians are victims and we need to protect them all and assist them all and that is our duty. Or you find yourself towards the end of this spectrum. They're all potential terrorists, they've all come to take our jobs, they're going to clog up our education systems and health systems and so on and so forth. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, the truth is somewhere in between. But the space to have that debate, to look at when migration is good and when migration might be a challenge, to recognise that most migrants arrive with positive aspirations, but a few may be criminals, to recognise that some people claiming asylum in Europe are certainly not refugees, to recognise that yes, one or two migrants might become radicalised and might eventually commit a terrorist outrage. We have to recognise the reality, we have to have a sensible debate. And in Europe, we have no longer got the space to have that sensible, rational, reasonable, calm debate. It's shrinking, and I think that's a real challenge at the moment. Let me illustrate that through just some reflections on the terror word, which is, of course, high on the agenda in Europe today. On the basis of a fake, and let me repeat the word, fake Syrian passport found next to the body of one of the perpetrators of the terrible Paris attacks last year, there is now a feeling in Europe, a fear in Europe, that we're under threat, that the Syrians are either potential terrorists themselves or that ISIS, in its canny ways, will infiltrate the boats that cross the Mediterranean and will bring terrorists into Europe. There's a real terror alert in many countries in Europe at the moment related to this so-called refugee crisis. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people I know who will absolutely not have this discussion at all. To even have a discussion about the links between migration and security, or even worse, migration and terror, is simply not acceptable. And I sympathise, because of course what we are doing is securitizing migration. And when you securitize migration, what do? You legitimize extraordinary responses. And that's what's happening in Europe today. Nevertheless, I think we should be having, again, a sensible, rational, reasonable discussion about the potential links between these two crises. The migration crisis on the one hand, the violent extremism crisis on the other hand. So let me quickly walk you through some ideas on that. Firstly, let's dispel the myths. Syrians are fleeing terror. They are not coming to perpetrate terrorist attacks. That is clear and evidential, and nobody should make that mistake. Secondly, there is no evidence at all, despite some very bold statements from some very important leaders in Europe today, that ISIS is infiltrating these boats and shipping over terrorists into our societies. No evidence at all that it's taken place. On the other hand, I would suggest to you that there are risks around radicalisation. Let me give you three. One is the risk of radicalisation in refugee camps and transit migrant camps where people spend long periods of time. Making a terrorist, it seems to me, is a fairly easy thing to do. You put a young man, normally a man, in a camp, you make him feel marginalised, you make him feel disenfranchised, you make him feel he has no hope, you leave him there for 20 years, and don't be surprised if there's some violent extremism emerging from that magical recipe. I don't think we should avoid the reality that there is a risk of radicalisation amongst some of these populations, especially if the situation becomes protracted in places like Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon. Secondly, clearly, and we've seen it, Anders Breivik in Norway, the arrival of people can generate extremism amongst the national population. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say some of the political leaders we have in Europe at the moment are quite that far gone, but they're pretty far gone, believe me. There is a risk that the arrival of large numbers of people is generating pretty extreme ideologies amongst some of the leaders and some of the citizens in Europe at the moment. The third, and I think most important link, or potential link, and this is the one that's really on my mind, is what happens if we don't get integration right. And I think there's a real challenge here. If we get integration right, this is about moving from the negative to the positive. This is about turning a humanitarian challenge into an economic opportunity. This is about making sure that Syrians arriving today do represent a talent pool, can fill labour market gaps, can contribute towards filling demographic gaps. If we don't get integration right, we'll be here in 20 years looking at a two-tier society, looking at more ghettos, looking at more Molenbeeks, looking at more banlieues in Paris, and don't be surprised if some of those people and their second and third generation descendants become radicalized. It's all, for me, about integration. I don't think many people arriving in Europe today will go home. I think we need to face the integration challenges, and I think we need to face them head on. That, for me, is the real risk. So, again, I think the refugee crisis, so-called, illustrates the real need and the real lack of an objective debate. I'm keen to start to wrap up because I know that John wants to come out here and give you the opportunity to ask questions and contribute towards this debate, and also presumably grill me on some of the things that I've said. I've hoped I've been provocative. I always say to my students, when I used to teach, don't just come with problems, come with solutions. And I'm aware that I've laid out a lot of problems on the table over the last 15 minutes or so. So let me conclude with a few possible solutions. The first problem I laid before you is that we have an increasing gap between perceptions and realities, especially in Europe. We know the evidence is clear that migration is basically positive. We know the evidence is clear that there is not a crisis of numbers even around the Syrians in Europe, and yet we are reacting out of all proportion. What can we do to bridge the gap between perceptions and realities? I think there are three answers, but none of these is easy and all of them is long term. One is about education. I think much more focus on intercultural dialogue, interfaith dialogue, tolerance in our schools. By the way, targeting not just nationals, but also migrants themselves, because I think this is a two-way street, and I think with rights come responsibilities. Education seems to me to be an important tool in trying to bridge perceptions and realities. Secondly, political leadership. I would argue that with the exception of Mrs. Merkel, and I'm sure we'll discuss Mrs. Merkel, and there are certainly criticisms of Mrs. Merkel, with the exception of Mrs. Merkel, I haven't heard any political leaders in Europe stand up in support of refugees or migration. They are playing to a short-term game, which is to win votes, and the way to win votes, believe me, in Europe today, is to be anti-migration. That's the way you're going to win the election next year. More political leadership, it seems to me, is fundamental. And thirdly, and I had the pleasure of writing with Ratner this morning in the Globe and Mail, which seems like a very reasonable newspaper. There are many newspapers and many media outlets in Europe that are absolutely not reasonable. We need a much more responsible media coverage. Those sorts of answers might be one way to try to bridge perceptions and realities, to convince people in my country, the UK, and many other European countries that they have nothing to fear. But we have to really address that. The second challenge I put before you was this notion of how to bridge short-term policy and political goals with the fact that migration really only pays dividends, and they're enormous dividends, but only does that after 5, 10, 15, 20 years, certainly out of our democratic cycles. I would suggest that one answer to this is to bring in the private sector. And I was delighted, Helena, to hear what you said about the importance of diversity and talent, making the business case. This isn't corporate social responsibility. This isn't charity. This is about making a profit. Migrants are part of diversity. Migrants are part of innovation. Migrants can add value to our corporate instincts and our corporate bottom lines. I think the private sector recognises that. I've worked, as Ratner said, for many years with the World Economic Forum focusing on migration, and one of our main aims has been to engage the private sector in this entire debate around migration. We found it very difficult to do. In Europe, migration is a toxic issue. For most corporate leaders, there's a greater downside than upside by having anything to do with migration. I think the current crisis has begun to change that. We have companies making direct contributions towards humanitarian assistance for migrants. We have people in companies who are offering apprenticeships and training and jobs, especially for the Syrian refugees as they arrive. Most importantly of all, business leaders are beginning to find their voice. If our political leaders are not willing to stand up and make the case for migration, I think we need to increasingly look to our business leaders. And we are at the WEF at the moment developing a migration agenda for the private sector, and one part of that is to ask business leaders to find their voice and stand up and make the case. That might be one way to overcome this short-termism versus long-term dividends. The final challenge I laid before you, how to promote an objective debate. Well, I hope this evening we're going to have an objective debate. I hope that you'll disagree with me. Perhaps some of you will agree with me. I don't really mind whether you're anti-migrant. All I want you to do is to listen to the other side. That's all I'm asking. I'm not asking for you to change your opinions. I'm not asking you if you love migrants, if you don't love migrants. I'm asking for you to understand that there are different perspectives and we need to listen to each other rationally, sensibly, and again understand the risks and the dividends, understand the good and the bad, and we need to find the space to do that. GDX, the work that Ratner is doing, is about promoting that objective debate. What is not about promoting that objective debate, and I say this as a former academic, what is not about promoting that objective debate is where academics pretend to be advocates. Academia is not advocacy. And I think increasingly I see again, I edit the Journal of Refugee Studies, a virtual hysteria amongst academics to be on the right side, to be politically correct, to say the right thing, rather than do what they're supposed to be doing, which is to have a rational, sensible look at the evidence and give us a basis for some sort of policy and analysis. So a little bit of self-criticism, and let me throw that out to you. So I think I'd like to conclude there before I think John will come to the stage. Europe's refugee crisis needn't be a crisis. It can be an opportunity, not a disaster or a catastrophe. I think it is symptomatic of three much greater challenges that we need to resolve. The first one, as I've said, is trying to find a way to bridge the gap between perceptions and realities around migration. The second is to try to find a way to focus our attention on positive, long-term goals, not short-term, quite negative challenges. And the third one, it seems to me, the most important of all, is to find the space to have an objective debate. Thank you very much.